What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Contrarian. My name is Logan. Today I will be talking about a tweet Michael Burry just put out there. Now, it's pretty uncommon to see Michael Burry's tweets actually on his own Twitter account. Thankfully, there's some archives out there where you can find most of his tweets, but he tends to delete them after just a few hours of them being up on Twitter. I'm not entirely sure why, but he just likes to be a pretty reserved guy, I think, and I can definitely understand that as well. So I'll just dive into Michael Burry's tweet very soon here. Effectively, he's saying that the Fed is bluffing at this point. The Fed is not aggressively fighting inflation. They're just trying to gain a little bit of ground before the economy goes into another recession, and they inevitably need to reverse course and do more quantitative easing. And effectively, a crack-up boom would result out of this. So I'll just dive into Michael Burry's tweet right now without adding any further thoughts of mine, and I'll get into what he's likely referring to after that. The Fed has no intention of fighting inflation. Serial half-point rate hikes are for getting elevation before stocks and the consumer tap out. Same with rapid-fire QT. The Fed's all about reloading the monetary bazooka so it can ride to the rescue and finance the fiscal put. So effectively, Michael Burry is saying that the Federal Reserve right now is all talk and no action. And if we look at where the real rate of returns are, they're extremely negative. They have arguably never been this negative before, at least in several thousand years. We do not have data from back then, obviously, but it has never been this low in modern history. Back in 1980, which is when the CPI was at the closest it's been to where it currently is. Have to go back all the way to 1981, I believe, to get back to where inflation was at an 8.5% annualized rate. So it's insane where bond yields are in relation to inflation. So in other words, the real rate of return has never been lower than where it currently is. Now, where this puts the Fed is in a very sticky situation because they have to act like they're aggressively fighting inflation when in fact they are not doing that. So they're having to put out ever more increasingly talkative statements like we will begin aggressively raising rates, etc. However, Michael Burry is saying that they're merely trying to gain a little bit of elevation above where they were in the short end of the curve, with the federal funds rate being basically 0% prior to the first 25 basis point rate hike, which was done about a month ago. So now they're sitting at, 0.25% of an interest rate on the federal funds rate when inflation is at 8.5%. That's still very negligible of a rate of return. However, the Fed might get in a few more rate hikes prior to when the economy could go into a recession, but Michael Burry is implying that that could be pretty soon based off of some past tweets he's put out there. Basically, as soon as inflation begins to run out of control, which it definitely already is in that territory, the consumer spending is going to fall very dramatically. As a result, corporate profits would fall dramatically and the economy would go into a recession, as it typically has always done when inflation begins to get out of control. Effectively, when the price of everything goes up, consumers are able to purchase less goods and services, and as a result, GDP falls, and that puts the economy into the definition of what a recession is. It's just a contraction in GDP. So in other words, then it's back to more quantitative easing for the Fed. In other words, Michael Burry is saying they're just trying to reload the monetary bazooka at this point. And they would effectively have to deploy all of this money out there in this coming recession, regardless of where the inflation is. And inflation could still be a very big issue at that time. It might not have contracted very much, in other words. So, in other words, there could still be a very high rate of inflation out there, even with the coming recession going on. So this would be what is known as a crack-up boom, and this is kind of an uncommon term out there. We very rarely see these. In fact, they really only occur at the end of monetary eras. So Weimar Germany type of inflation, this would have been a crack-up boom kind of era. A crack-up boom, according to Investopedia, is An economic crisis that involves a recession in the real economy and a collapse of the monetary system due to continual credit expansion and results in unsustainable rapid price increases. This concept of a Crackup boom was developed by Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises as a part of the Austrian business cycle theory. The Crackup boom is characterized by two key features. One, excessively expansionary monetary policy that, in addition to the consequences described in Austrian business cycle theory, leads to out-of-control inflation expectations, and two, a resulting bout of hyperinflation which ends in the abandonment of the currency by market participants and a simultaneous recession or depression. So in other words, Michael Burry is saying that in all likelihood the Fed continues on its current path of very marginally raising rates until they are forced to reverse and just continue to expand monetary supply with quantitative easing, maybe more direct payments to consumers, whatever they need to get the economy going again. But as a result of that, this would likely result in, very high inflation, if not hyperinflation, and this would eventually result in the demise of the dollar. Now we're already beginning to see this with regards to Russia and China. Russia in particular, which was cut off from the SWIFT banking system, is effectively going to be coming up with their own means of exchange or different means of exchanges for doing trade with certain countries who are willing to do it with them. Recently, in a noticeable press release, they just announced, or they encouraged the BRICS nations to essentially join forces with them to come up with a means of exchange which does not utilize the US dollar or the SWIFT banking system. So this is very significant, but we do need to see how this does shape out. But in other words, the Fed will continue on its current path until they cannot do it any longer, until inflation gets way too far out of the bag and they are not able to finance any more debt. And this would eventually lead to the demise of the US dollar. So in other words, easy money is never easy to put back in the bottle. And the Fed will always choose to print more money to try to print its way out of its sticky situation rather than aggressively raising rates and crashing this everything bubble that it's created. In other words, this never has happened before where the Fed just decides, hey, we're going to choose what to do, what is right. We're going to really aggressively raise rates. We're going to reduce our balance sheet. We're going to allow prices to collapse as much as they need to. The Fed has never, in the history of central banking, has never chosen to do that option. So it's very unlikely, if not unforeseen, that they would choose to go with this option as opposed to just printing more money, trying to print their way out, keep everybody happy for as long as they can. They have never done that before. So in understanding a Crackup boom a little bit better, the Crackup boom develops out of the same process of credit expansion and the resulting distortion of the economy that occurs during the normal boom phase of Austrian business cycle theory. In the Crackup boom, the central bank attempts to sustain the boom indefinitely without regard to consequences such as inflation and asset price bubbles. The problem comes when the government continuously pours more and more money, injecting it into the economy to give it a short-term boost, which eventually triggers a fundamental breakdown in the economy. In their efforts to prevent any downturn in the economy, monetary authorities continue to expand the supply of money and credit at an accelerating pace and avoid turning off the taps of money supply until it is too late. And obviously, until now, the Fed has had some pretty good excuses, or they've tried to make them good excuses, in order to keep a quantitative easing going and some more very generous programs that were instituted at the beginning of the pandemic. Obviously, initially, they had the excuse of the pandemic itself. They stretched that out for as long as they could. Then they had the excuse of supply chain issues. They've stretched that out until, now, even when they've gotten worse. And now they have the excuse of the whole Russia and Ukraine conflict, even though the US really doesn't have much to do in that conflict. It is affecting the US, obviously, but they're coming up with any sort of excuses they can to keep this cycle going and to really not fight inflation in any meaningful way. So in other words, the Fed knows that it is stuck. They really just need to keep the narrative going for as long as they possibly can, because when the narrative does flip and when the average consumer becomes aware that inflation is raging out of control, and when they become aware that the Fed is not serious about fighting it, that's when hyperinflation really sets in, because at that point, people just begin hoarding goods. Demand for goods and services goes through the roof, or the prices go through the roof as a result as well. And basically, it just makes matters worse. So, if anything, once it finally does reach that stage of the mindset of inflation setting in, consumers realizing that the Fed is not fighting inflation, that's when the cat is really out of the bag, and the Fed has really no hope at that point of ever getting it under control. So you might be asking yourself, well, what would happen after this Crackup boom? And effectively, what would need to happen after the demise of the dollar as the US world reserve currency is something similar to what put it in place as the reserve currency, which was the Bretton Woods Agreement. And so central banks would need to come together. They would need to form a new agreement and say, this time we're going to, have this be the world's reserve currency. It's probably not going to be one currency. It's likely going to be something like what Jim Rickards has talked about, of being more a basket of currencies around the world. There's also the likelihood that it ends up being some sort of central bank digital currency. Obviously, at the World Government Summit, which just happened recently, it was very strongly hinted that central banks around the world are very quickly going in that direction, which is not a good sign if you like freedom in your transactions. But governments around the world love controlling that sort of thing. So unfortunately, that's likely the direction that central banking is going, is towards a central bank digital currency. And in other words, they wouldn't allow another sort of exchange outside of that. It would give them a lot more control. I highly recommend you go and watch that clip out there that they just announced, this new sort of a development in the central bank digital currency world. But all this being said, this is a long-winded way of explaining Michael Burry's tweet regarding inflation, the Federal Reserve, and how they're not very aggressive, and how this is likely all designed. So all of that being said, let me know what you guys think down in the comments regarding Michael Burry and his thoughts. I like to talk about views that are not commonly expressed out there in the mainstream media. So if you like this content, just consider subscribing to this channel, and I hope to see you again.